I'm so sorry for this insanely long hiatus. I'm so happy to be back. I was on a crazy French book tour for over 2 weeks, helping promote the French translation of Unfamiliar. If I met you on that tour, every single person I met was so wonderful. All the fan art and gifts I received were so sweet, and I just wanted to thank you so much. As for everybody else, I want to thank you for your patience, and don't worry, the videos will be getting uploaded on their regular schedule starting now. Hey everybody, it's LavenderTowne. When I was a kid, the way I could tell a Disney movie from, say, a Dreamworks or Pixar one was that Disney movies were in 2D. Often hand-drawn, hand-painted 2D, with movement reference painstakingly from a human actor. Now it's a lot harder to tell. Disney shuttered its 2D studios and has abandoned its sincere fairy tale fare for more self-aware and snarky stories. To be clear, I'm not saying one is necessarily better than the other. I know it's common for people to get nostalgic for what they had as kids, and I don't want to fall into the pit of thinking that everything was better back in my day, but I do feel like we lost something here. Mainly because Disney now is making something that we already had back in the day, and as they walk in the footsteps of their competition has kept moving forward, making stylistically more interesting 3D films, while Disney doesn't seem able or willing to do the same. And I do find it hard to defend this current era of Disney when they're releasing things like Mufasa and Moana 2 into theaters. But what if Disney had never shut down their 2D studios? What if all their modern stories were done in their old school 2D style? That's the question I'm going to try to answer today. As a little style experiment, I'm going to try to take the modern 3D characters of Disney films from this era and do my best to mimic their old style. Starting off, I wanted to try to do an animal character first, mainly because when I was interested in Disney, I really liked the stories with animals the most. I loved Jungle Book and Aristocats and Fox and the Hound, even though it pretty much ripped my heart from my body. So I'm going to try to do my first style emulation with the rabbit Judy Hopps from Zootopia. Zootopia was an interesting Disney movie because it was utilizing the writer that made many Pixar movies really popular, John Lasseter. This was before his big fall from grace, but Zootopia ended up becoming pretty popular, and I do think that this was a major example of Disney kind of abandoning its previous tastes, not just visually but also in its storylines. You can see that in Zootopia there's a real push to be kind of modern, and time has always been kind of interesting with Disney movies. A lot of Disney movies are adapted from older fairy tales that were old even when these movies were being made all those years ago. So there would be hints of modern things, like a lot of the Disney princesses would have little flares on them that would imply the era that the movie was actually made rather than the setting that the movie was in. For example, the hairstyles often reflected when the movie was released, not when the movie was actually set. But it was always sort of a mixture of times, whereas a movie like Zootopia is pretty much straight up like a modern movie. You see them with iPhones, essentially, modern police department, and the whole structure of Zootopia is very clearly in a modern setting. It's not that this never happened back in the day with Disney movies, but it was much less common. There was usually some sort of time mixing. Now, fortunately, there's a ton of reference images I can use from the old Disney because there are so many rabbit characters. We have Thumper from Bambi, we have rabbits in really old Disney animations from back when they were doing more of that rubber hose kind of thing. We have rabbit characters from Robin Hood. We, of course, have the White Rabbit from Alice in Wonderland. So it did make it easier for me to reference, but it was still very, very difficult. This was kind of my first practice attempt at imitating this style, and I did find it quite difficult. It has an interesting aura to it. I feel like with the beautiful painted backgrounds, it's hard to even get that kind of level of authenticity on a digital art program. I tried my best to imitate it here, and I also tried to make sure that my method of like building up the shapes was the same, with like a thick animator's pencil and that sort of thing, but I still think this one's kind of a flop, though she does look sort of cute, all chubby like this. Like all their rabbit characters from before are kind of like chunked up, even the girly girl ones at the bottom. So she looks really adorable, but I don't know if it's exactly right. One of my favorite things ever is looking at the old video clips that they use to animate really old like Disney princess movies off of. It's really weird and amazing to see how they used to do it, and these big like circles of animators watching this model essentially run around and dance around with her big puffy hair and her big puffy dress. So I wanted to kind of emulate that with our attempt at Rapunzel. Tangled was like the first big 3D Disney princess movie, and I do think that it paved the way for everything that's happening now. I still see her face kind of on all the faces of all the 3D Disney princesses, even the ones who have quite a different sculpt from her. Something about her like quirkiness and her eyes and everything I even see in characters like Moana, who have a pretty different like face sculpt to her. I don't know if that's just me, but I do feel like she's kind of like embedded herself into all the future Disney princesses that we see. I wanted to, for this one, reference a real image of a real person. Here I decided to use a girl who was doing aerial silks, because I thought that would be the best sort of imitation of the way that she's always sliding around on her hair in the movie. And then for her face, I wanted to get that right because I felt like I kind of messed it up with our Judy Hopps character. So I have a bunch of images of young characters' faces. As you can see, we have Snow White, who's like 14, 15, and Alice, who's a little younger than that. Now, Rapunzel is supposed to be like 18, but she comes across as quite a bit younger than that, so I decided to use a younger face. She still looks older than she does in the 3D. This is something that I've noticed. The older Disney like hand-drawn girls look older than any of the 3D ones, even like Elsa, who's supposed to be like 21 or something like that. I think it's just the way that they're stylizing with much bigger eyes. It makes them look very babyish, and especially in the 3D, I think that makes it even more dramatic looking. So they look very young, and it's interesting because I'm literally using like a child aerial silk model and images of even younger Disney characters from the past, and she still looks so much older and more mature in my drawing. I don't know if I just messed something up or if this is just a feature of the way that they're stylizing now, but I do think aerial silks was the right way to go. I feel like her pose is kind of like a more poised and natural version of what she'd end up doing in the actual film. I know that Walt Disney himself really got very attached to this more realistic style of animation where the bodies are moving more in the way that a real human's body would move. And it's interesting because now we've kind of gone back to the oldest form of animation where everything's pretty exaggerated and pushed really far, like the poses are pushed really far. I really like stylization, so I don't think one is better than the other. And I have actually a real soft spot for the rubber hose, really dramatic style of old school animation. But I do think it's interesting that like this really lifelike type of animation is basically gone now, unless you're counting like, again, the quote-unquote live action Lion King, which like we're not even gonna call it that. Like, let's be serious, this is a CGI movie. But we have kind of lost this. Everyone's very like cartoony again. I think this is Disney trying to imitate Pixar and Dreamworks, who were doing really well. But yeah, it's kind of interesting seeing her in a more naturalistic pose where everything's not pushed so far, and she looks a little bit more human and less doll-like. But yeah, I was pretty happy with how this one turned out. Next up, I wanted to try Elsa, and I had a good feeling about this one because I felt like she would map onto two previous examples really well. For her face, I thought the angularity of Aurora would work really nicely, and then for her dress and her coloration, I thought Cinderella would be perfect. Initially, I was quite worried because her 3D model has this really glittery dress, and in 3D, glittery is a lot easier to do because you can literally like put a glittery material on your 3D model and just kind of move it around. Not a big deal, but when you're hand drawing something and drawing it over and over and over again, you can't really do that as well. But luckily we have this great example with Cinderella of how glitter would be done by hand in a realistic way, and so I was able to just pretty much copy that. So her face was my first concern, and this was the time where I really started to notice the way that the line art is done. In pretty much all of the Disney films that I looked at that are 2D, the line art is colored, and is colored to be as close as possible while still being visible to the color that is inside the area. So it gives it an overall softer look, and it explains to me why when I've tried to do this in the past, my art has never looked like the Disney style. It's because I was using hard black line art, and of course that's not going to look right because apparently this softness was a really key factor in the way that these images looked, which is really obvious now that I'm looking at them closely. But that's one of the reasons these style challenges can be really fun and rewarding. Even if you don't actually nail it, you've still learned something new, which I think is really cool. Now, one of the issues I ran into with this one is that as I was sort of color copying Cinderella onto Elsa, I definitely noticed that Cinderella has a warmer blonde tone. Initially, I was going to just push past it and pick out my own like platinum silvery color for her hair, but I ended up actually keeping it like this because I thought it was really interesting seeing her kind of embodying this entirely different color palette. I thought it was actually really pretty, like it looks so soft, and I do feel like that platinum blonde is just very, very modern feeling. So in order to really make her look like a retro Elsa from a, you know, an alternate universe where Frozen came out in like the 50s, I thought it would look really cool. So this one I wasn't as happy with because I think I made her eyes too big, but other than that I was pretty okay with it. Okay, last up I wanted to do May from Turning Red. Now, I wanted to use this example because this is a situation where the thing I said before is actually not true, where I was basically criticizing Disney for not doing anything interesting stylistically with their more modern movies, and using 3D in more interesting ways. This is one example where that's not true. Turning Red is actually a really well animated movie, and it does look super unique. Like as you're watching it, every single way that the characters move and the way that they are stylized is really different to any other Disney movie that I've seen. It is clearly inspired by Akira Toriyama, the creator behind Dragon Ball, and I just think that that's so cute and so clever and such a great way to make 3D look really different. She also snaps into poses a lot, rather than smoothly flowing between them the way that they do in a lot of the other 3D Disney flicks. I think this movie is massively underrated. It's not a perfect movie, but I really do think it kind of got ripped off by not being released in theaters, and I think it would have been a way huger hit if it was given the kind of support that a lot of their other movies got. So anyway, in trying to draw this character in the old style, it's a little bit tricky because we don't have a ton of similar references. For her hair, I kind of utilized Snow White as an example because they do have a similar kind of hair structure. I looked at Mulan, of course, because she's like one of the only major East Asian Disney characters that were ever in 2D. But other than their ethnicity, their faces don't really look anything alike, so I couldn't really use that reference as much. I basically based her off of other like children from old Disney movies, and again, like her nose is really small and she's got pretty round eyes and a pretty like big expressive mouth. So I did try to keep those features on her while also mapping to this much more subdued stylization. I do think it just makes her look way less interesting. Like, I'm such a fan of the way that Turning Red was animated that it's hard for me to look at this as anything other than a massive downgrade, but I did my best, and honestly I just wanted to talk about Turning Red at the end of this movie. I also swapped out her Tamagotchi with a clock just so that it would look more like old and period PC, and I also reduced some of the detail on her sweater just because, again, when you're not doing 3D and you're doing 2D, these types of patterns are too much of a pain in the butt. So I did want to kind of make that a little simpler for our imaginary 2D animators who would have to move her. Okay, so here are some of our 3D girls flattened. It was fun to talk about this. I still think I need to practice the stylization a bit more, but please let me know if you try this out yourself, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you so much to my wonderful patrons and members, including Stop Spinning, Silva Soul, West Art Channel, A Playful Fawn, Prince Piplup III, Mash In It, Forco, Honey Kitten 18, Nee Nico, Novel Goblin, Lauro, Data, Lily McFarlane, Artist James, Skitten, Gold Pikachu, Among Us Skibbity, Asri Cryptid, Glee, Hoodie Doodle, River D Goblin, Gato de Luz, Goodbye Number 4, Raz Tarosh, Becca, Kobe Octo VTuber, Graveyard Moss, Grexius, Maddie Momo, The Midwestern Menace, CB, Lucia Majiki, Live Live, Ravenscrow, Zosalot, T-Hill Music, Jabber Dabber Doo, Light Julie, Kadaria, Astral Fox Art, The Expressive Poker Face, Tsubaki, Cutie Pie, Kola, JJ Jade, and of course, blah 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 blah.